Welcome to this new episode of the Virulent Vortex, a podcast in which we discuss infectious disease across scales, from pathogens and molecules to populations, pandemics, and everything in between. My name is Jaap de Rode. I'm a biology professor here at Emory University and also your host of today's show. And with me today, we have Nadimpalli, who is an assistant professor of environmental health here at the Rollins School of Public Health. Maya, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Jaap.
So we have talked about your research before, and a lot of it focuses on antibiotic resistance.
Sure. So antibiotic resistance refers to when bacteria don't respond to the medications we normally use to treat infections caused by bacteria. This can happen naturally over time, but really accelerates when we overuse antibiotics or use them inappropriately. And antibiotic resistance in general, also called AMR, antimicrobial resistance, is becoming more and more common across the world, which means clinical infections can be harder to treat, more expensive to treat, can result in longer hospital stays. And sometimes, and this is happening more often, unfortunately, we don't have any medications at all that can treat a person's infection, in which case it can be deadly.
Yeah. So you mentioned overuse. So when I go to the doctor and I have a viral infection and I ask them, can I get antibiotics? They will say no. And that is to prevent that overuse?
Well, often they'll say yes, unfortunately.
Oh, I must have a good doctor then.
They shouldn't say yes, but certainly people are taking antibiotics all the time in situations when they really shouldn't be taking antibiotics.
Yeah. When antibiotics first came to market, they were really heralded as wonder drugs that could really take care of all these infections. But you mentioned then the bacteria can evolve this resistance, the drugs no longer work, and now we have situations where people really cannot be treated anymore. So is this, how big is this problem?
Well, great question. There was a group that published in The Lancet recently, and they estimated that in 2019, there were 5 million deaths across the globe attributable to bacterial infections that were resistant to antibiotics. And there are several pathogens that are responsible for the majority of these kinds of resistant infections, things you probably heard of like staph infections, E. coli, Klebsiella pneumonia, and a bunch of others. So it is a problem, and it's getting bigger and bigger.
Oh, that sounds really scary.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And so we talked about antibiotic use for treatment of infections, but I've also heard that antibiotics are used in agriculture a lot.
Yes, we use antibiotics in agriculture. So I'm not really sure when this practice started, but people realized that if you give animals, let's say pigs, for example, a low dose of antibiotics every single day through their food or through their water, it helps them gain weight more quickly. Farmers can sell those animals and get a new flock in, and thereby increase profits. And so this practice has really taken off. That's the use of antibiotics for growth promotion. But then, of course, antibiotics are used in agriculture the same way that we use them to treat infections, but also prophylactically. So I think many of us know that most animals are raised in like quite large scales. We have barns that can have hundreds, thousands of animals at one time. And so when some animals get sick, it's common practice to give antibiotics to maybe all the animals in the barn to prevent that antibiotic or that infection from spreading.
And so is it safe to say that overall more antibiotics are used in agriculture than in human medicine?
Yeah, so in the US, it's a little bit hard because we don't have great estimates from the agricultural side, but it's estimated that about 75% of antibiotics that are sold each year are sold for use in animals and not for use in human medicine.
Wow, that is massive. Yeah. And so how does your own research relate to this?
This lab that I was working in had noticed they were able to detect drug-resistant bacteria, methicillin-resistant staph, in surface waters, so rivers and streams in that area. So I heard about that and I was like, why would there be drug-resistant bacteria in water near pig farms? And that's when I learned for the first time about how much antibiotics we give to pigs and other animals that we raise for food. And we wanted to test the hypothesis that this antibiotic use was potentially resulting in the selection of the same kind of bacteria that we were detecting downstream from these farms.
Yeah. And so how much of a problem is that to humans? So you get this antibiotic resistance in the pig farms, it gets in the water. Does it actually make it to us?
So I would say here in the US, the biggest risk is for the people who work with animals. So you have, as I mentioned, thousands of animals, hundreds to thousands of animals being raised in barns, and you have 10, 15 people who are responsible for kind of all the activities involved in animal raising. So you can imagine that they are like very intensely in contact with animals, right, with dust, with other aerosols in that environment. In terms of our risk, like you and I would say it's actually pretty low. So yes, we were detecting these bacteria in surface waters near farms, but these are not places where people are swimming. So yeah, I mean, these kinds of things that you and I rely on to protect our health, we don't even realize they're protecting our health. They're just part of our normal infrastructure. The fact that we can turn on our taps in our houses and get clean drinking water. The fact that we can flush our toilets and never have to think about what we just put in that toilet and never have to come into contact with that ever again. The fact that we can go to the grocery store and expect that generally we're not going to get sick from the food that we're purchasing. There is so much infrastructure in place in this country to protect our health. Right. And that also serves as a way to prevent us from being exposed to pathogens, including drug-resistant pathogens that might be selected for in animal agriculture. And that kind of infrastructure to this kind of scale does not exist in many countries all over the world, including in places where animal production is really ramping up.
Yeah. And so do you specifically research these situations in other countries at the moment?
So I have some ongoing work in Peru, which is, they eat a lot of chicken. Chicken production is really amping up in Peru. The reason I started becoming interested in how potentially problematic this might be was when I was doing work in Cambodia, which was a few years ago. So I did a postdoc abroad and started working on a project that was based in Cambodia, Senegal, and Madagascar. And we were noticing really high levels of drug-resistant bacteria among healthy people, just circulating among healthy people in Cambodia. Could animals be contributing to antibiotic-resistant bacteria among the broader population in a way that we wouldn't see here in the US?
Is that what you found?
We saw a lot of similarities between the bacteria on meat products that we were finding among healthy people. So many of us, we have lots of bacteria living in our guts. Some fraction of that can be antibiotic resistant without, us having any symptoms of infection. And we were finding that those drug resistant bacteria in people's guts was very, very similar to what we were seeing on food. And that kind of similarity is not seen in Western settings. Then when we looked across scales and looked more closely at these bacteria, it wasn't just the bacteria themselves that were similar, but the kind of mobile genetic elements they were harboring. So these are smaller circular bits of DNA that often encode antibiotic resistance genes, the things that actually make a bacteria resistant to antibiotics. Bacteria can kind of pass these little circular bits of DNA between themselves. And when we looked at bacteria from people, from fish, from pork products, from chicken products, we saw that these resistance elements, these plasmids, they themselves were extremely similar across bacteria.
Yeah, and so then to think about applications of your work, you mentioned earlier, a lot of these problems we don't face here because of all the infrastructure. So do you think that is the solution for other countries that don't have that infrastructure yet? Or are there other ways that we can stop those problems with antibiotic resistance?
So antibiotic use is the number one driver of antibiotic resistance. And I think we all recognize that. And we're trying to figure out ways that we can try to reduce reliance on antibiotics, especially prophylactic purposes in many countries. Now, you asked, should we also work on developing public health infrastructure in these other countries? There are a lot of reasons why we should be doing that. Antibiotic resistance, I would argue, is just like one small additional reason why we should be doing that, reducing the spread of resistance between humans and animals. So I think there's a lot more work to be done. But I think recognizing that that's something that we also need to be focusing on, potentially with just as much importance as antibiotic stewardship, is what I'm hoping to get across through my research.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. So it's really using different approaches together to really tackle this problem and hope that it doesn't get even worse than it already is.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking about your research, and we wish you a lot of luck with your ongoing work and hopefully tackling this very big problem. We'd like to thank you for watching this episode. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you for the next one.